14 hours after Elias Rourke came back to the surface, the men in the dry house noticed something strange. Not fear, not injury. His hair looked lighter, not grey, not white, just drained somehow, as if the colour had been washed out by dust that would not come off. He had spent nearly 12 years underground in the iron mines around Ishpeming. Cave-ins didn't shake him, flooded drifts didn't shake him. Even blasting accidents rarely left him speechless. But after his descent into the cliff's shaft mine in the autumn of 1891, he refused to explain what he had seen. For 9 days, according to the story later repeated among miners, he answered every question with the same sentence. It wasn't supposed to be there. What exactly he found is impossible to verify. The mine was real. The men were real. The expansion work taking place that year was real, but somewhere below the mapped workings, beyond the levels shown on company surveys, Elias claimed he entered a passage that should not have existed, and at the end of it stood something that raised a far more disturbing question, not who built it, but how long it had been waiting there beneath the Great Lakes before anyone found it. If forgotten stories like this pull at you, subscribe to the Forgotten Century. These are the kinds of investigations that rarely make it into textbooks, real places, real records, and questions that never seem to receive complete answers. The algorithm tends to bury stories like these unless viewers actively keep them alive. So if this kind of hidden history deep dive interests you, consider joining us for the next descent. By 1891, the iron country around Ishpeming barely slept. Day and night, ore trains rattled across the Marquette Range. Steam whistles echoed through the forests. Men disappeared underground before sunrise and often emerged after dark, covered in red dust that settled into every fold of their clothes. The cliff's shaft mine stood at the center of that world. It was one of the most productive iron mines in the region. The ore beneath the hills was rich, hard specular hematite, dense, valuable, the kind of ore that helped build railroads, bridges, and factories across a rapidly expanding America. That part is documented. So was the atmosphere of the time. The year 1891 marked a period of change. Ownership structures were shifting. New investments were arriving. Surveyors were examining old workings and planning future expansion. The pressure to locate additional ore bodies was enormous. Every new discovery could mean years of profit. Elias Rourke fit naturally into that environment. The records do not contain a miner by that name. He is a dramatized figure assembled from accounts of miners who worked the range during that era, but men like him absolutely existed. He would have been in his late 30s. Irish parents, strong enough to swing a hammer all day, experienced enough to recognize when rock behaved in ways it shouldn't. The old miners often carried stories with them underground. Most were harmless. Tales of abandoned drifts, lost levels, voices carried through rock, lights seen where no lamps burned. Elias reportedly dismissed most of them, but one story lingered. Several older workers claimed that some of the earliest exploratory crews had encountered workings that did not appear on company maps. Not natural voids, not ordinary stops. Something older. Nobody could point to evidence. Nobody could agree on details. Yet the rumor survived. Then came the assignment. Officially, it was routine. A section of the mine associated with earlier exploratory activity needed inspection before new development proceeded. Old timber had to be checked. Ground conditions had to be assessed. Survey markers required verification. Nothing unusual about that. Mines constantly revisited older workings, but there was one detail that later gave the story its staying power. The level Elias was sent to examine sat near the edge of areas that had already generated confusion among survey crews. Different maps showed slightly different layouts, nothing dramatic, just enough inconsistency to create arguments. A missing crosscut here, an unexplained measurement there, the sort of discrepancy normally blamed on imperfect 19th-century surveying. The official reason for the inspection was safety and planning. That much is entirely plausible. What happened afterward is where certainty begins to disappear. Because according to the version of events passed between miners for years afterward, Elias descended expecting to inspect aging timber. Instead, he found himself following a route that extended beyond the limits shown on the company's own plans. And the deeper he went, the harder it became to explain what he was looking at. The descent began before dawn, a cold October morning, the kind that settled over Michigan's iron country with a damp chill drifting inland from Lake Superior. At the surface, men moved through routine preparations. Lamps were trimmed, tools were checked, or cars rattled somewhere in the darkness. Nothing about the morning suggested that it would become a story repeated for decades. Elias stepped into the cage. The signal bell sounded. Then the floor dropped away. At first, everything was familiar. The timbered shaft walls slid upward past the cage. Heavy beams flashed through the lamplight. Water trickled down black rock. Iron guides groaned as the cage descended level after level. Experienced miners paid attention to details, not because they were curious, because mistakes underground could kill them. Elias knew roughly how long it should take to reach each station. He knew where the air normally changed. He knew the smell of fresh blasting powder and the smell of old workings abandoned for years. Nothing felt wrong. Not yet. The cage stopped. He stepped out onto a known level. Survey stakes, ore cars, fresh timber, normal activity. He checked the assigned area and continued toward older workings connected through a series of drifts and crosscuts. The farther he moved from active mining, the quieter the world became. That was normal, too. Sound dies underground. The deeper sections of a mine often feel disconnected from everything above. Eventually, he reached ground supported by timber that looked older than the rest. Not dangerous, just different. The wood was darker, more worn. The tool marks seemed inconsistent with recent construction, a detail most people would ignore. Elias didn't. He paused long enough to run a gloved hand along one of the beams. Then he kept moving. A few 100 feet farther, he encountered the first thing he could not easily explain. A survey mark. At least it appeared to be one. It had been cut directly into rock. Not painted, not chalked, cut. The symbol did not resemble the standard markings used by the company, nor did it resemble common miners' notations. Could there be an ordinary explanation? Absolutely. Another crew. An earlier survey. Someone passing time underground. Any of those possibilities fit the evidence. But the mark bothered him enough that he remembered it later. Then came the temperature change. That was harder to dismiss. Generally, deeper workings become warmer. Not dramatically warmer at every point, but warmer. Instead, according to the story, the air ahead felt cooler. Not much, just enough to notice, enough that he stopped and raised his lamp. The passage narrowed. Rock walls pressed closer together. Water dripped steadily somewhere beyond the edge of the light. He continued, step after step, boots crunching over loose fragments of hematite, the beam of his lamp swinging across timber and stone. Then another detail appeared. The rock itself looked different. Not entirely different, just wrong in a subtle way. Most miners develop an instinct for geology. Years underground teach them to recognize bedding patterns, fractures, and ore contacts almost automatically. Elias later claimed the wall ahead displayed long, unusually straight surfaces. Not machine smooth, not polished, but straighter than he expected from natural breaks. Again, there are ordinary explanations. Natural jointing can produce remarkably regular faces. Rock often surprises people. Still, the sensation grew stronger. Something about the place felt organized, as though the geometry was becoming more deliberate the farther he traveled. The official survey line should have ended nearby. According to the maps available at the time, there should have been little reason to continue much farther. Yet a narrow opening remained, easy to miss, hidden behind older timber and fallen debris. Not a dramatic secret door. Nothing like that. Just a continuation, a route that appeared neglected rather than blocked. Elias squeezed through. The noise of the mine faded. No distant ore cars, no voices, no hammer strikes carried through rock. Only water. and his own breathing. The lamp flame flickered. He checked it. Everything seemed normal, yet the silence felt heavier now, as if he had crossed an invisible boundary. Then he noticed the next marker. Unlike the first symbol, this one appeared more intentional. Several cuts, parallel lines, deeply incised into stone, too deliberate to ignore. He crouched beside them, studied them, tried to understand their purpose. Nothing came to mind. When he stood again, his lamp illuminated something farther ahead. Not an object, a shape, an angle, a line that seemed completely out of place underground. He took several steps closer, then stopped, because for the first time that morning he was looking at something that did not resemble a natural formation, and beyond it the passage continued downward, far beyond the depth where he believed he should have been. Elias stood still for several seconds, not because he was frightened, because he was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Miners spend enough time underground to understand a simple rule. The earth is messy, rock twists, veins wander, faults break patterns apart. Nature rarely favors straight lines. Yet the feature ahead seemed built around them. The angle he had noticed from a distance resolved into something stranger as he approached. The wall on his left ended abruptly, not in a fracture, not in a collapse, in a surface that appeared almost deliberately cut. It wasn't smooth enough to prove anything. A modern engineer would not mistake it for machine work, but it possessed a consistency that made Elias uncomfortable. He lifted his lamp. The light crawled upward. The surface continued higher than he expected, then disappeared into darkness. The passage beyond narrowed briefly before opening again. He followed it. 10 steps, 20, 30. The temperature remained oddly cool. The air felt still, not stale, still, as though it occupied a space isolated from the normal circulation of the mine. That detail matters because old miners often judge distance and connection by airflow. Fresh drafts suggested openings. Dead air suggested isolation. This felt isolated. The floor changed next. Loose rock gave way to a firmer surface, not paved, not finished, just unusually level, enough that he noticed it immediately. The further he advanced, the more the geometry repeated itself. Straight edges, unexpected symmetry, angles appearing where curves should have dominated. None of it individually proved anything. Taken together, it created an impression difficult to shake. Then the passage widened. His lamp pushed deeper into darkness, and for a moment he thought he was looking into a natural chamber. The Upper Peninsula contains countless irregular cavities created by geological processes. A chamber would not be surprising, but this one felt different. The ceiling rose gradually, rather than chaotically. The walls seemed to hold a rough alignment. Even the proportions appeared unusual, not perfect, not architectural in the modern sense, simply organized, as though natural space had been altered by intention. Elias stepped forward. The beam of his lamp reached the center and stopped on iron. At first he assumed he had found an exposed ore mass. That would have been completely reasonable. The mine existed because of immense concentrations of iron-bearing rock. Large ore bodies were common, but the shape bothered him immediately. The object rose vertically from the floor, not a vein cutting across stone, not an irregular mound. A vertical mass, dark, massive, nearly cylindrical. His first impression was that it resembled a pillar, not a natural description a geologist would choose, just the word that came to mind. A pillar. He circled part of it. The lamp revealed bands of oxidized metal, patches of mineral growth, areas that appeared fused to surrounding stone. If the story is true, the object was enormous, far larger than anything one person could have moved, far older than anything associated with 19th century mining. And here we reach the point where documentation ends. No surviving company report describes such a discovery. No geological survey confirms it. No physical evidence remains available for examination. Everything that follows comes from later retellings. That distinction matters. What Elias supposedly believed is not the same thing as what can be proven. According to the story, he became convinced that the object was not simply an ore formation. Several details drove that conclusion. First, portions appeared to maintain a remarkably consistent curvature. Second, the surrounding chamber seemed arranged around it rather than the reverse. Third, faint markings reportedly existed along one side, not letters, not words, just shallow linear patterns that looked intentional. Could mineral processes create something deceptive? Absolutely. Geology produces formations that seem artificial with surprising frequency. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We often impose design where none exists. Any honest examination has to acknowledge that possibility. Yet Elias reportedly struggled to accept it. He raised his lamp higher. The pillar continued upward. The ceiling swallowed its upper extent. He could not see where it ended. Then he noticed something even stranger: the base. Part of it appeared embedded within older rock layers rather than merely occupying the chamber. If true, that detail would create an uncomfortable implication. The object would not simply be inside the formation, it would appear integrated into it, as though the surrounding geology had developed around the structure over immense periods of time. Again, there is no way to verify this account, only the story survives. But according to miners who later repeated it, Elias remained in that chamber far longer than intended, studying, measuring with his eyes, trying to force what he was seeing into a framework that made sense. Nothing fit. Not company construction, not known mining equipment, not an ordinary ore body, not anything he expected to encounter beneath a Great Lakes iron mine. Eventually, he did what most experienced miners would have done. He left, not running, not panicking, just leaving. Because underground, uncertainty can be more disturbing than danger. And as he retraced his path toward the known workings, another realization began to settle in. The object itself might not have been the most important discovery. The more troubling question was this: if a chamber like that existed beneath one of the most heavily worked iron districts in North America, how many people would need to know about it before it disappeared from the record? This is where most stories like this take a wrong turn. They jump immediately to a vast conspiracy. Secret societies, mysterious orders, hundreds of silent participants, but that is not how information usually disappears. The more useful question is simpler. If something genuinely unusual had been encountered inside a major iron mine in 1891, what would the response actually look like? Let's treat it as a logistics problem, not a legend, not a theory, a process. Start with the first step: detection. A miner discovers something unexpected. That part requires no conspiracy at all. Mining history is full of surprises, unknown voids, ancient workings, fossils, unmapped tunnels, unexpected geology. The first person who sees something strange tells a supervisor. That is how mines function. Information moves upward, not outward. The mine captain is informed. Perhaps a surveyor is called. Perhaps an engineer. Perhaps samples are collected. Nothing extraordinary yet. In fact, this is exactly what companies are supposed to do. Now imagine that the discovery creates a problem, not necessarily a historical problem, a financial one. That is important. People often assume suppression begins with ideology. In reality, it frequently begins with risk. Suppose surveyors arrive and conclude that public discussion could trigger complications, questions about ownership, questions about future development, questions about investor confidence, questions they are not prepared to answer. The response would not require dozens of accomplices, only a handful of decision makers: a mine captain, an engineer, a company manager, maybe a corporate office several hundred miles away. By 1891, telegraph communication already connected industrial America. Reports could move quickly, sketches could be copied, measurements could be transmitted, instructions could return within hours or days. Again, entirely ordinary. Now consider evidence transfer. If unusual samples were removed from the site, where would they go? Not to newspapers, not immediately to universities. They would likely enter the company's own chain of custody first. Engineers routinely gathered specimens. Surveyors routinely archived maps. Corporate offices routinely stored documents. The movement of information through internal channels was standard business practice. A modern observer looking backward might see only silence. But silence does not automatically imply conspiracy. Sometimes it simply means records entered a private system and never emerged again. Then comes the crucial stage: access control. This is where the story becomes interesting, because minds already possess mechanisms for restricting access. No secret police required. No elaborate operation. A dangerous drift can be closed. A flooded section can be abandoned. A timbered barrier can be erected. Maps can be revised. Work routes can be redirected. These are everyday mining decisions. The average miner goes where he is assigned. He does not wander wherever he pleases, especially in a large industrial operation. Now ask yourself a practical question. If management wanted a specific chamber visited by as few people as possible, how difficult would that be? The answer is, not very. The physical environment does most of the work. One barricade, one revised map, one safety order, and suddenly access drops from hundreds of workers to a handful of authorized personnel. No dramatic secrecy required, just procedure. Then there is the issue of the shaft itself. Stories in mining regions often claim that entire discoveries were hidden by sealing tunnels. Sometimes those stories are exaggerated, but the underlying mechanism is real. Mines constantly close sections. Rock pressure destroys passages. Groundwater floods levels. Timber collapses. Development shifts elsewhere. A drift can become inaccessible surprisingly quickly, particularly in 19th century workings where maintenance demands were relentless. Even without deliberate intervention, access can disappear. With deliberate intervention, it becomes even easier. Suppose a company decides that a particular route should no longer be used. Additional timbering could block it. Waste rock could be dumped into it. Survey references could be altered. Future crews might never realize what once existed beyond the obstruction. Again, not a fantasy, a logistical reality. Now consider the final piece: memory. People assume evidence survives if enough witnesses exist. History suggests otherwise. Industrial communities are transient. Workers move. Companies merge. Records are transferred. Buildings burn. Offices close. Managers retire. A story known by 20 men in 1891 can become a rumor by 1910 and a legend by 1940. No grand operation necessary, only time. And that is why the logistics question matters more than the discovery itself. Because whether Elias found an extraordinary geological formation, an abandoned human-made structure, or simply misunderstood what he saw, the mechanism by which such knowledge could vanish is entirely believable. The challenge is not imagining how a secret would be hidden. The challenge is realizing how little effort might actually be required, especially underground, especially in an era when the earth itself helped keep records buried. This is where the story returns to solid ground. The Cliffs operation was real. The expansion of iron mining across the Marquette Range was real. The constant revision of underground surveys was real. And so was the instability of the historical records surrounding industrial sites of that era. The late 19th century was not an age of perfect documentation. Far from it. Maps were updated by hand. Mine plans changed repeatedly as new ore bodies were discovered. Workings were expanded, abandoned, flooded, and re-entered. A survey that existed in one office might never appear in another. When companies reorganized, records moved. When buildings burned, records vanished. When mines closed, entire archives sometimes disappeared into storage or were discarded. That is documented history, not speculation. The Cliffs mine itself evolved continuously throughout its productive life. New levels were opened. Older areas became inaccessible. Engineering priorities shifted with the economics of ore extraction. A mine that appears fixed on paper is actually a constantly changing environment. That reality creates an important problem for anyone investigating stories like Elias's. Absence of evidence is not evidence of a discovery, but neither is it proof that nothing unusual happened. The surviving historical record simply cannot answer every question. There is another detail worth considering. The iron ranges around Lake Superior generated countless local stories. Most vanished. A few survived. The stories that survived usually shared one characteristic. They attached themselves to real places, real shafts, real levels, real communities. The legend surrounding Elias persisted because it remained connected to a mine people could point to, a place they passed every day, a place that genuinely existed. Could generations of miners have exaggerated a routine geological feature into something mysterious? Absolutely. That may be the most likely explanation. Could an unusual formation have inspired a story that grew larger with every retelling? That happens constantly in mining history. I cannot prove otherwise. But there is one reason the story refuses to disappear. The official record explains production, ownership, ore quality, engineering achievements. It explains how the mine operated. What it does not explain is why so many independent versions of the same tale continued circulating among workers long after the people involved were gone. Perhaps that means nothing. Perhaps miners simply enjoy a good story. Or perhaps somewhere inside that legend lies a small fragment of an event that never found its way into a report. An inspection, a forgotten drift, a chamber that wasn't expected, a question that nobody could answer. And once that possibility enters the picture, the surviving record begins to feel less complete than it first appears. Years later, the details had already begun to blur. Dates shifted. Distances changed. Certain parts of the story grew larger with every retelling. That is what legends do. But one image remained remarkably consistent. Not the chamber, not the markings, not even the iron pillar itself. The image people remembered was a map. According to the old accounts, Elias kept a rough sketch for most of his life. Nothing elaborate, just a few lines. A route, a turn, a place marked deeper than it should have been. Whether that sketch truly existed, nobody can now prove. If it did, it never surfaced publicly. If it survived, it vanished somewhere along the way. And that may be the most fitting ending possible, because the mystery was never really the object beneath the mine. The mystery was access, a path known by a few people, a route that may have existed for a short time and then disappeared beneath the ordinary machinery of industrial progress. Today, the surface landscape has changed. Generations have passed. Records have been archived, lost and reorganized. Yet somewhere beneath the iron country overlooking the Great Lakes, old workings still wind through darkness. Some mapped, some forgotten. And perhaps that is the question worth carrying with you. If a miner in 1891 truly stepped beyond the limits of the known mine, how many traces of that journey would still remain today? Maybe none. Maybe just a rumor. Or maybe one sealed passage, waiting where no modern survey thinks to look. If you found this story worth remembering, share it with someone who still believes history leaves shadows behind.